Controversy over old newsletters, that is, published in the name of Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul. They contain some shocking statements about blacks, gays, other minorities. Ron Paul adamantly, though, denying writing those statements. Ron Paul is standing by to join us live in just a moment. But first, let's get some background. Brian Todd is taking a closer look at this story. Brian?
Thank you. Thank you for serving our country. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
He's not considered a presidential frontrunner, but Ron Paul's raised tens of millions of dollars from a devoted base, many of them young people who love his libertarian straight talk.
The role, of course, is to return this country to sanity.
But how's this for straight talk? June 1992, right after the L.A. riots. In a copy obtained by CNN of the Ron Paul Political Report, one of several newsletters published in his name during the 1980s and 90s, quote, order was only restored in L.A. when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks. Another excerpt. The criminals who terrorize our cities, in riots and on every non-riot day, are not exclusively young black males, but they largely are. As children, they are trained to hate whites, to believe that white oppression is responsible for all black ills, to fight the power, to steal and loot as much money from the white enemy as possible. None of the articles we found say who wrote them.
Ron Paul's spokesman says those words, published between Paul's two stints as a U.S. congressman from Texas, were not written by Paul, and he finds them abhorrent.
Not good enough for one political veteran.
These stories may be very old in Ron Paul's life, but they're very new to the American public, and they deserve to be totally ventilated. I must say, I don't think it's an excuse in politics to have somebody go out under your name and say, oh, by the way, I didn't write that.
In some excerpts, the reader may be led to believe the words are Ron Paul's. In the Ron Paul Political Report in October 1992, the writer describes carjacking as the hip-hop thing to do among the urban youth who play unsuspecting whites like pianos, writes about advice from others on how to avoid carjacking. Then, I frankly don't know what to make of such advice, but even in my little town of Lake Jackson, Texas, I've urged everyone in my family to know how to use a gun in self-defense, for the animals are coming. Paul's spokesman says Paul has lived in Lake Jackson for years, but says Paul never wrote that, is saddened that someone took advantage of him, and points to Paul's statement saying, I have publicly taken moral responsibility for not paying closer attention to what went out under my name. We spoke to the editor of Reason, a libertarian magazine which shares some of Paul's beliefs on big government. He says he's never heard Paul speak like that, but
what he has not done, what I think some people are looking for him to do, is to say, okay, who wrote what? I mean, there's 20 years, give or take, worth of newsletters there.
Newsletters that rant against Martin Luther King, the Israeli lobby, gays, and AIDS victims. Many of them were reported this week by the New Republic magazine. There's one newsletter addressing American militias, ranting against the federal government, saying if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. That's from January 1995, just as Ron Paul was getting set to take office in his second stint in Congress. Paul's spokesman says the candidate doesn't know who wrote any of them. When we asked if Mr. Paul would try to find out, the spokesman said, no. What's the point? This is 15 years old. It's time to move on. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
And Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul is joining us now live from the campaign trail in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Congressman, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about it. How could this happen? Because I've gone through some of these old Ron Paul newsletters, and it's got your name bannered on the top, and some of these comments, as we just heard from Brian's piece, are pretty shocking.
Yeah, it is, and of course it's been rehashed a long time and it's coming up now for political reasons. But everybody knows in my district that I didn't write them and I don't speak like that, and nobody has heard me ever say anything like that. And I've been reelected time and time again, so everybody knows that I don't participate in that type of language. But the point is when you bring this question up, you're really saying you're a racist, or are you a racist? And the answer is no, I'm not a racist. Matter of fact, Rosa Parks is one of my heroes. Martin Luther King is a hero because they practiced the libertarian principle of civil disobedience, nonviolence. Libertarians are incapable of being a racist because racism is a collectivist idea. You see people in groups. A civil libertarian like myself see everybody as an important individual. It's not the color of their skin that is important, as Martin Luther King said. What is important is the character of the individual. You know what is really interesting, though, and this might be behind this, because I, as a Republican candidate, probably am getting the most number of black votes and black supporters, and now that has to be undermined. mine. And I do this because I attack two wars that blacks are suffering from. One, the war overseas. In all wars, minorities suffer the most. So they join me in this position I have against the war in Iraq. And what about the war on drugs? What other candidate will stand up and fight in the can and say, I would pardon all blacks, all whites, everybody who are convicted for nonviolent drug acts and drug crimes? And this is where the real discrimination is. Let me